I need a wife, the mafia boss said, staring at me from his wheelchair. I was just a broke ER nurse drowning in my brother's leukemia bills. Dante Varley offered a twisted contract: play his devoted wife for 12 months to secure his criminal empire, and he'd make my financial nightmares vanish. But surviving the mob is hard, and surviving the dangerous chemistry between us might be entirely impossible.
Let us open this case file together and examine the exact moment a psychological trap snaps shut. It begins in an environment already primed for trauma. Nurse Lena Carter was operating in chronic autonomic arousal. The fluorescent lights of the emergency weeks, she recognized this as a systemic, institutional collapse. Then, a dying man gripped her wrist, his blood ruining a high-end suit. He gasped for her to tell Dante Varley that the contract still stood. That name, a known psychological trigger for terror in the criminal underworld, initiated an acute stress response in Lena. Within 48 hours, she would face the ultimate manipulation by the man himself, subjected to a proposition designed to dismantle her entire reality. The clinical term for her state is compassion fatigue, the inevitable outcome when empathy costs the brain too much energy. Lena had been on shift for 14 hours. Her physical distress was evident, ignoring a torn sneaker for 2 months because financial survival superseded comfort. When the trauma alert sounded, her conditioned reflexes took over. She secured fresh gloves, an automatic action built over 6 years of crisis management. Paramedics wheeled in the casualty amid sirens and shouting. The subject was a male, in his mid-40s, with a gunshot wound, exhibiting classic signs of hypovolemic shock. Lena systematically removed his jacket. He possessed no identification, but the medics noted his repetitive, frantic vocalizations regarding a man named Varley. The auditory stimulus of that name barely registered through her cognitive state. For 20 minutes, she operated in controlled medical trauma, attempting to stabilize his vitals. "You are going to be fine," she offered, a standard verbal placebo, his eyes locked onto hers with frantic hypervigilance. Identifying himself as Marcus Chen, he gripped her wrist with terminal panic. He demanded she tell Dante Varley the contract still stood, terrified his family would suffer if he was perceived as disloyal. "I will tell him," Lena promised, using a psychological de-escalation tactic without grasping its severe future consequences. At 11:47 p.m., the monitor's flatlight died, leaving behind a ruined suit and a fatal, if haunting message for Dante Varley. Observe the pressures forcing her toward a psychological break. Her superior reacted to the name with facial flattening heave, warning her to be careful. Returning home at 2 in the morning, Lena found her 19-year-old brother, Danny, awake and visibly emaciated. He quickly closed his laptop, an avoidance behavior she instantly challenged. The screen revealed a financial catastrophe of medical bills from his 8 months of leukemia remission. Lena had already liquidated her assets and exhausted 2 credit cards, desperate to control the uncontrollable. Danny suggested deferring the payments, displaying the premature maturity seen in chronically ill youth. These compounding financial and emotional stressors were systematically eroding her remaining mental defenses, priming her for the trap. "You are going to college like we planned," she insisted, projecting an illusion of control to mask her profound financial impotence. Her sleep architecture was severely disrupted. Fragmented by night terrors of a dying man's grip, she accepted another hospital shift out of sheer economic survival. 3 hours into her rotation, a behavioral anomaly occurred. 2 men exhibiting the rigid, hypervigilant posture of professional enforcers approached her. They were not police. They stated Mr. Varley requested her presence. Notice the immediate shift in group dynamics here. The surrounding medical staff engaged in active avoidance behaviors, physically distancing themselves from Lena without a word. The mere invocation of the target's name initiated a localized primal contagion of extreme fear among her peers. Lena attempted to assert boundary control by stating she was working. The enforcer dismantled her resistance instantly, noting her supervisor had already authorized her departure. This is a classic tactic of a megalomaniac, stripping the subject of their institutional support to enforce total isolation. Lena changed clothes, her motor skills compromised by adrenaline tremors. Cognitively, she understood the extreme danger. Yet, cognitive dissonance compelled her forward. She rationalized her compliance as honoring a promise to a dying man, a psychological defense mechanism used when facing overwhelming coercion. She approached the waiting black Mercedes, its tinted windows acting as a dark manifestation of the predatory world she was entering. Flanked by enforcers, Lena entered the vehicle. They drove her to a restricted underground garage, an environment explicitly designed to intimidate. A private elevator propelled her to a sprawling penthouse. The space used minimalist design, reflecting a highly organized, controlling psyche. Let us evaluate the primary subject together. In the center of the room sat a man in a wheelchair. Dante Varley turned to face her, deliberately shattering her preconceived behavioral profiles. She expected a hardened, aggressive sociopath marked by visible violence. Instead, his calm, refined presentation entirely contradicted his lethal reputation, initiating a profound cognitive disorientation within her. The subject was approximately 35, exhibiting premature graying indicative of chronic stress. His ocular behavior was analytical, devoid of psychopathic emptiness, but radiating a heavy psychological weight. Dante established conversational dominance. When Lena noted her lack of autonomy, he reframed the forced extraction as a choice, a classic manipulation tactic used to manufacture consent. He instructed her to sit, and her compromised nervous system complied. Dante bypassed all social protocols, verifying the casualty in the hospital. Her realization that he possessed surveillance over medical staff highlighted his absolute systemic control. She recited the victim's final words about the contract, strictly observing a microscopic fluctuation in Dante's otherwise rigid micro-expressions. She witnessed not conventional grief, but a sociopathic accounting of lost loyalty. He noted Marcus was a rare asset. Lena pushed back, demanding to know who caused the fatality. Dante evaluated her directness, categorizing her resilience as a useful psychological variable. She attempted to terminate the interaction, but the trap was fully shut. He maneuvered his wheelchair closer, exerting spatial dominance. He then introduced the primary stressor. He required a wife for a 1-year duration. In exchange, he would systematically eradicate her severe financial trauma. Lena labeled him insane, a normal defensive reaction to reality distortion. Dante simply called himself practical. Examine this moment closely. This is the exact genesis of the Stockholm dynamic, offering absolute salvation wrapped in total captivity. Let's look at this case file together. You and I. We start with Dante. 6 months ago, an accident confined him to a wheelchair. For a megalomaniac narcissist operating a criminal empire, physical weakness is blood in the water. He needed a human shield, a prop to project stability. He chose Lena. Why her? She was in the room when a man named Marcus Chen died, carrying his final message. But more importantly, she was drowning in medical debt for her brother, working double shifts just to survive. Dante didn't choose her out of romance. He targeted her vulnerability. He knew a desperate person is a compliant person. The lesson here is simple. Predators do not look for equals. They look for leverage they can exploit. From a clinical perspective, Lena's reaction is fascinating. She wasn't insulted by this invasion of her privacy. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Dante laid out the terms with surgical precision: 1 year. She lives in his penthouse, acts as dutiful wife at public events, and in exchange, her brother's medical debt vanishes. His tuition is fully covered. At the end of 12 months, she walks away with enough money to disappear. Dante explicitly stated he was buying legitimacy, securing his fractured organization from rivals who smelled blood. He demanded no emotional attachment. But stepping into a sociopath's world is never a simple transaction. The cost is always much higher. Dante gave her 24 hours to decide, a classic psychological pressure tactic. He told her if she refused, she could simply go back to her life, knowing full well that her life was a sinking ship. The truth of her poverty sat in the room like a physical weight. She returned to her cramped apartment in a complete daze, her mind fracturing under the stress of impossible choices. When she walked through the door, she found her brother Danny cooking the cheapest pasta they could find, their dinner for the next 3 nights. The impulse to confess everything almost broke her. She had to physically bite her tongue to keep from ruining his innocence. Sometimes, the heaviest burdens we carry are the truths we hide to protect our family. Stick with me here, because this is the exact moment the trap closes. That night, Lena lay staring at the ceiling, weighing her crushing reality against a mobster's promise. She remembered the sheer terror in Marcus Chen's eyes right before he died, the kind of absolute dread Dante Varla inspired in his enemies. Against that nightmare, she placed Danny's health, his college degree, and freedom from the debt choking them for 2 years. The next evening, she stepped back into the elevator with Dante's suited enforcers. She walked into that glass penthouse and immediately demanded conditions. She thought she was negotiating, asserting control over her fate. But negotiating with a megalomaniac only creates the illusion of power. She demanded the contract in writing, detailing every single penalty. She demanded the entire east wing of the penthouse to preserve her boundaries, and she insisted on keeping her job as a nurse at the hospital. She refused to let her entire identity be swallowed by Dante's shadow. Dante pushed back, of course. A kingpin's wife working a civilian job invites unwanted scrutiny. But he compromised on reduced part-time hours. He reinforced the lie that this was strictly a business arrangement. No affection, just a generous payout for a necessary service. It is a common defense mechanism to believe we can compartmentalize trauma. We draw lines in the sand, forgetting entirely that the tide is coming in to wash them away. They shook on it. Even from a wheelchair, Dante's grip was hard and calloused, a physical reminder of his capacity for violence. He informed her the timeline would be aggressive. The legal documents would be ready the following morning. They would make their public debut as an engaged couple at a high society charity gala that Friday, followed by a wedding exactly 2 weeks later. Just enough time to build a facade of legitimacy, but not enough time for rivals to probe the cracks. 3 days prior, Lena's biggest crisis was buying new shoes. Now, she was binding herself to a man whose mere name terrified seasoned surgeons. Life can completely pivot in a matter of seconds, locking us into a reality we never could have anticipated. As she turned toward the elevator, Dante quietly thanked her. He promised to make the ordeal as painless as possible. But as the city lights blurred outside the glass, the reality of her decision began to metastasize in her mind. She told herself she was doing this for her brother, for financial survival. But she had not calculated the psychological toll of existing beside a predator. performing a counterfeit romance for an audience of wolves. This is the very soil where Stockholm Syndrome takes root, when the victim begins to rely on the captor for safety from the very danger the captor created. The next morning, her hand barely trembled as she signed the heavy legal documents, sealing herself inside a perfectly constructed cage. Let us open this file together, shall we? We begin with the initial deception. The subject, Lena, constructs a fragile lie for her brother Danny, claiming a lucrative new position. She suppresses the grim reality that she has commodified her existence for a man whose empire rests on blood. By Friday, the psychological stripping begins. Dante, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, deploys a team to erase her identity. Hair, makeup, a midnight blue dress whispering of illicit wealth. They replace her authentic self with a fabricated skin. When Danny praises her beauty, she issues another lie, layering the foundation for her detachment from reality. Dante awaits her in his vehicle, his expensive suit acting as the armor of a predator. The lesson here is simple. Every lie we tell isolates us further from the people we are trying to protect. Stick with me. We need to observe Dante's behavioral shift here. Outside his sanctuary, he adopts a hyper-vigilant persona, projecting the impenetrable facade required of a criminal kingpin. They arrive at the Meridian Hotel, a sterile monument populated by the ultra-wealthy. For Lena, this environment is deeply disorienting. When Dante enters, the social hierarchy instantly recalibrates. Notice how his physical deficit, the wheelchair, does not elicit pity, but rather amplifies his dominance. He commands her to stay close and smile, an overt exercise in coercive control. She, displaying the early compliance typical of Stockholm Syndrome, obeys without question. It reminds us of a fundamental truth. Power is rarely about physical strength. It is almost entirely about the unwavering belief in your own authority over others. She moves through a labyrinth of veiled threats masquerading as elite discourse. Enter Victoria, operating within Kotsaimakotcakram, displaying tactics of a competitor, displaying the cold gaze of a competitor. Upon learning Lena is a nurse, Victoria deploys deliberate condescension, a classic devaluation tactic. Dominance, Lena's nervous system prepares for conflict, but Dante physically intervenes. His hand on her arm is not affection. It is a calculated restraint. By publicly defending her virtue, he undecil as her sole protector, cementing himself as her sole protector. Victoria retreats behind a mask of tightened hostility, leaving an atmosphere thick with unspoken violence. Lena questions their relationship, attempting to map out this dangerous new environment. The lesson we can draw is clear. An enemy's polite smile is often far more dangerous than a drawn weapon. You and I must analyze how Dante rationalizes his manipulative reveals. Well, perhaps casually is the wrong word, that his fake engagement to Lena dismantled a strategic alliance with Victoria. He reduces human lives to mere chess pieces, typical of a megalomaniac narcissist. Explicitly instructs Lana that her function is to serve as a biological shield against political maneuvers. As the evening drags on, Lena observes the intense load required to maintain his facade. She detects the micro-expressions of chronic pain he suppresses, the tightening ocular muscles, the white-knuckled grip on his mobility device. When she attempts to diagnose his suffering, his response is a sudden, aggressive verbal snap. He cannot tolerate the exposure of his vulnerabilities. It teaches us a harsh reality. Those who build walls to protect their pain will crush anyone who tries to climb them. We see here the pathological rejection of weakness. Dante equates physical pain with a loss of absolute control. Their return to the penthouse is marked by a suffocating, hostile silence. Lena, suffering from acute environmental exhaustion, initially submits to his rules. However, Upon re-entering the isolation of their shared quarters, her psychological resilience flickers. She refuses to accept the emotional freezing out, confronting him about the untenable nature of a year-long prison sentence. In a fascinating display of manipulative calibration, Dante drops the hostility. His unreadable expression gives way to a quiet, seemingly genuine apology. He offers a microscopic concession to ensure she remains compliant and emotionally tethered to her captor. The takeaway is profound. Sometimes an apology is not an expression of remorse, but a calculated leash. She probes further, diagnosing whether his distress is physiological or social. Lena steps into his personal space, offering assistance without demands. For a mind accustomed only to transactional relationships, this altruism triggers deep suspicion. Yet, he grants her access to his private quarters, a sterile environment devoid of emotional artifacts. She transitions seamlessly into her clinical role, evaluating his pharmacology. Muscle relaxants, anti-inflammatories, neural blockers. When he expresses gratitude, she frames her actions as purely contractual, claiming she only wishes to keep him functional. But the psychological transference has already begun. By becoming his caretaker, she is actively investing her empathy into a dangerous man. This illustrates a dangerous human flaw. We often confuse the act of healing someone with the act of changing who they fundamentally are. Let us consider the establishment of their new normative baseline together. Lena occupies the East Wing, a gilded cage that dwarfs her previous life. Her primary focus shifts to managing the Kingpin's biology, monitoring his intake, and decoding his suppressed pain signals. They maintain a calculated, polite distance to prevent emotional enmeshment. However, forced proximity inevitably breaks down these barriers. During a nocturnal encounter, she observes him exhibiting symptoms of profound isolation. When she sits nearby, offering a non-threatening presence, the silence acts as a psychological catalyst. The megalomaniac narcissist finally yields a crucial piece of his suppressed trauma. He confesses that his paralyzing injuries were a deliberate assassination attempt. The life lesson here is stark. True loneliness does not come from being alone, but from surviving a world that wants you dead. He displays a flat affect regarding his near murder, demonstrating the fatalistic acceptance typical of career personal accountability as an assertion of ultimate control. When Lena probes for regret, he dismisses the emotion as entirely useless. He tells her they are all dying, projecting his internal decay onto the entire human condition. When she insists he use her first name, it marks a critical milestone in the breakdown of professional boundaries. He tests her name, allowing a moment of genuine vulnerability to breach his armor. He then interrogates her core motivations, recognizing that financial desperation alone does not explain her compliance. She stands at a crossroads, debating whether to maintain her defensive deception. It is a sobering reality. The moment we stop hiding our true motives is the exact moment we give our enemies the power to destroy us. The intimacy of the dark environment acts as a disinhibitor. Lena confesses the trauma of her brother's leukemia and her subsequent financial ruin. She admits that selling herself was an act of raw survival, a compromise of her moral framework. In response, the Kingpin validates her trauma. He reframes her perceived moral failure as an evolutionary strength. This is highly effective psychological conditioning. He presents himself as the only entity who truly understands her sacrifice. When she voices her fear of identity loss, he validates her resilience, noting that weak individuals perish in his world. We are witnessing the cementing of Stockholm Syndrome here. By validating her pain, he establishes a profound, twisted parity. We end this session with a chilling truth. Shared trauma can bind a victim to a monster far more tightly than any physical chain ever could. Let's examine the foundational trauma of our subject, Lena. Orphanhood forced her to abandon medical school to raise her brother, Danny. Dante, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, exploited this perfectly. After talking until dawn, he held her hand, thanking her for treating him like a normal human being. You and I must recognize feigning this tactic, feigning vulnerability. As the arranged wedding rapidly approached, Lena felt the first pangs of what we clinically identify as the onset of Stockholm Syndrome. When Danny noticed her behavioral shift and confronted her, she lied. The life lesson here is stark. Isolation is always the predator's first requirement. The moment you hide reality from those who love you, the psychological cage is locked. When cornered, the victim invariably defends the captor. She confessed she was getting married, triggering Danny's rational panic. He correctly identified the anomaly. She was overworked and suddenly engaged to a ghost. When he asked if she sold herself to pay their bills, his clinical accuracy nearly shattered her facade. But the narcissist's conditioning was already taking root. Lena maintained eye contact and delivered the fabricated narrative of sudden romance. Danny, possessing a baseline trust in his sister, reluctantly demanded to meet Dante. She deferred the threat, a classic avoidance tactic. We see this pattern constantly, right? The victim becomes the enforcer of the abuser's fiction. The lesson is sobering. Desperation forces good people to build walls of deceit, and eventually the architect of those lies becomes the prisoner. Observe the physical stripping of identity. Stylist handled Lena like a high-value asset, wrapping her in garments that functioned as a financial brand. When a security operative addressed her as the new Mrs. Varley, the psychological severing was complete. She was no longer a nurse. She was property. The wedding was a masterclass in controlled environments, entirely eliminating her support system, save for her bewildered brother. Dante waited in his wheelchair, using his physical deficit to project a disarming blend of authority and fragility, a textbook manipulation. His unreadable expression betrayed the cold calculation of a predator, securing its prey. Their vows were merely verbal contracts, devoid of empathy. The life lesson we extract here is fundamental. Whenever an environment actively works to erase your past identity, it is preparing you to submit to a new, dangerous one. The public kiss was a calculated behavioral display, a sterile seal on a clandestine contract. The reception operated as a theater of compliance, with Lena perfectly mimicking the required social protocols among guests who recognized the transaction. Returning to the penthouse, the spatial dynamics shifted. They stood on opposite ends of the room, separated by a profound cognitive dissonance. She verbalized the boundaries of her confinement by declaring they only had 1 year. Yet, the seeds of Stockholm Syndrome were already germinating. She began to perceive a tragic complexity in her captor, a dangerous distortion where the victim romanticizes the threat. As she retreated to her wing, her internal conflict peaked. You and I know how this unfolds. The life lesson is unavoidable. When you negotiate with a sociopathic structure, you never control the terms of your own survival. The initial cohabitation was defined by strategic avoidance. The narcissist establishes dominance through environmental control, turning silence into a weapon. Absolute silence. Dante operated from his fortified office, while Lena used her hospital shifts as a psychological sanctuary. She relocated her brother to a better apartment, using money disguised as corporate benefits. This deception induced a severe cognitive load. When Danny accurately observed her exhaustion, noting she returned home to a virtual stranger, he attempted an intervention. Lena deflected, deploying the evasive techniques of a hostage, protecting their captor's narrative. The life lesson is simple, but rarely learned in time. Physical comfort purchased with moral compromise will always bankrupt your peace of mind. You can never truly compartmentalize your own survival. Danny's assessment that Dante viewed her as a business acquisition was clinically flawless. Unable to process the truth, Lena initiated a flight response, retreating to the very environment that endangered her. At the penthouse, she intruded on a syndicate. Dante sat with Vincent and Carlo, men whose physical posturing radiated systemic violence. Dante introduced her as his wife, using the title not with affection, but as a territorial marker. Vincent's old-world courtesy was merely an investigative tool. His handshake was a preliminary psychological assessment. He smiled, but his ocular focus triggered Lena's primal threat detection, making her skin crawl. Notice how the trap thickens here. The critical life lesson is clear. Your intuition is rarely wrong. When your biology screams that a politely smiling face is a predator, you must listen to it. Vincent's claim that Dante was being protective was a calculated probe to test the narcissist's control. Carlo micro-remained aggression, a deliberate to grant her aggression, signaling his refusal to grant her status. When Dante terminated the meeting, Vincent's parting welcome to the family functioned as a verbal subjugation, a threat masked as etiquette. In the aftermath, Dante deployed a classic interrogation tactic, inviting her to ask whatever she wanted. By inviting her inquiry and subsequently denying her a real answer, he asserted absolute cognitive dominance. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? The abuser dictates reality by controlling access to the truth. The life lesson here is visceral. Intimacy cannot exist where information is weaponized. If someone demands your vulnerability while offering only walls in return, they are not protecting you. They are managing you. Dante's defense, claiming she knew what this was, is the standard rationalization of the megalomaniac, placing the psychological burden on the victim. But then a strategic deviation occurs. Dante reveals the syndicate's operational structure, detailing Vincent's laundering and Carlo's violent enforcement. He acts as the martyr, bearing the violent darkness, while she reaps the financial rewards. This calculated flash of vulnerability, the deep exhaustion he allows her to witness, is the catalyst for Stockholm Syndrome. Lena's empathy overrides her survival instinct. She observes that his life sounds incredibly lonely. In clinical terms, she has just bonded with her captor's trauma. The life lesson is tragic but necessary. Empathy is a beautiful human trait, but when carelessly applied to a calculated predator, it becomes the very chain that binds you in the dark. Let's examine this case together, you and I. We see the classic push and pull of the megalomaniac narcissist. Dante masks his need for total control under the guise of mere practicality. When he tells Lena her persistence isn't a flaw, he is laying the groundwork for deep psychological manipulation. The moment between them feels fragile, but it is a calculated tension. When his phone rings, shattering the illusion, she flees to the hospital, seeking refuge in the familiar. Trauma victims often retreat to environments they can control. She takes an early medical shift, fleeing the penthouse before he even wakes. It is a fundamental truth of human behavior. We will always sprint toward the familiar chaos we know, rather than face the quiet, terrifying unknown of a new prison. In the emergency ward, Lena surrounds herself with blood and broken bones. A physical manifestation of her internal state. Her colleagues probe about her sudden marriage to a wealthy magnate. Must be love, they suggest. She forces a smile, suppressing the cognitive dissonance. For a victim slowly succumbing to Stockholm Syndrome, the outside world's perception becomes a sharp irritant. She buries herself in the rhythm of trauma care until Dante's call breaches her sanctuary. He issues a directive. Not a megalomaniac demands a unify with Vincent. The megalomaniac demands a unified front. The collision of her two realities triggers a profound somatic anxiety. The lesson here is quite simple but devastating. You cannot compartmentalize your life indefinitely. The walls will always fall. Observe the psychological conditioning at play. When the transport arrives at 8:30, Lena is exhausted. Waiting for her is a calculated gift, an expensive, deep red garment, accompanied by Dante's handwritten note. A healthy psyche would recognize this as a violation of autonomy, a forced costume for his theater. Instead, she feels a flutter of appreciation. This is the insidious onset of Stockholm Syndrome. The captive begins to interpret control as care. She transforms her appearance, discarding her true identity to reflect his idealized image. When they meet, he subtly diminishes her by noting her fatigue, reestablishing in silence. It reminds us of a chilling reality. The most effective cages are never made of iron. They are woven from silk. Look closely at the spatial dynamics here. You and I can see the predatory geometry. Vincent waits in a secluded corner, the classic environment for covert interrogation. Dante places his wheelchair at the apex of the table, demanding absolute visual authority. When Vincent probes, suggesting Dante never acts impulsively, he is testing the structural integrity of their fabricated bond. Lena's response is fascinating from a clinical perspective. Under threat from an outside predator, the captive instinctively aligns with her primary captor. She reaches for Dante's hand. He returns the gesture with a calculated warmth. Life often forces us into impossible psychological corners, teaching us that when faced with wolves, a person will lean against the wolf they mistakenly believe they can tame. Vincent's interrogation is a textbook stress interview, designed to map Lena's psychological fault lines. He weaponizes her tragic backstory, the early loss of her parents, offering synthetic sympathy to gauge her emotional resilience. Notice how he complements her ability to manage difficult situations. It is a veiled threat, an acknowledgement of her utility in their criminal enterprise. Throughout this clinical dissection, Dante remains eerily silent. The megalomaniac narcissist rarely intervenes when his prized asset is being tested. He prefers to observe, cataloging her defensive mechanisms, evaluating how perfectly she mimics his own sociopathic composure. It is a dark truth of survival. The scars we carry are exactly what predators look for to see if we can carry their burdens. The psychological trap finally snaps shut over the dessert course. Vincent strips away the veneer of social pleasantry to reveal the syndicate's operational reality. He frames her marriage not as a romantic union, but as a crucial pillar of institutional stability following Dante's catastrophic accident. He is explicitly tying her physical existence to the survival of the organization. For Lena, the cognitive realization is crushing. She is not merely a contracted wife. She is the human shield guarding a deeply fractured empire against rival predators. Dante sharply interrupts, asserting that she knows her place. His intervention is an assertion of ownership. When we sell a piece of our soul for temporary relief, we never truly read the fine print until the devil comes to collect. Clarity prevents misunderstandings, Vincent states, a sociopathic euphemism for a death threat. When they are alone, Dante refuses to offer her any genuine psychological reassurance. When she asks if she is in danger if she fails to perform, his answer is a chilling single word, imperative: don't. This is behavioral conditioning at its most absolute. In the silent transport back to their luxurious enclosure, Lena experiences severe ego depletion. She longs to regress to her former state of poverty, where her anxieties were merely financial, not existential. She has traded her autonomous identity for velvet chains. It is the ultimate tragedy of ambition and desperation. We willingly abandon our unremarkable lives, only to realize the gilded palace we sought is a maximum security cell. Let's unpack this crucial confrontation, you and I. Back in the penthouse, the psychological fatigue finally breaches Lena's defensive barriers. She shatters the quiet, confessing her profound terror. She admits to feeling like a fractured pawn in a violent, unwritten script. She turns the analytical lens onto Dante, challenging his pathology. Is there any humanity left, or is he pure strategy? We see a rare microfracture in the megalomaniac's armor as his hands tighten on his wheelchair. He admits that maintaining the sociopathic facade is exhausting, that his constructed image is a heavy, precarious monolith. When he confesses he doesn't know what happens when the mask slips, it's dangerously honest. The walls we build to protect ourselves eventually become the walls that crush us. This is the exact moment the Stockholm Syndrome fully metastasizes. Faced with her captor's vulnerability, Lena instinctively moves physically closer, offering him a safe emotional harbor. Dante's response is chillingly self-aware. He fears that stripping away the narcissistic defense mechanisms will reveal an absolute void. They are two traumatized individuals, trapped in performative identities that have superseded their true selves. When he reaches in for her hand, this time devoid of any external audience, it is a devastatingly intimate breach of protocol. He praises her not for her authenticity, but for her flawless deception. Horrified by her genuine response to a ruthless kingpin, she violently severs the physical contact. The most dangerous moment is when the monster shows his heart. Lena attempts to reassert logical boundaries, fleeing to her room. She leaves the narcissist positioned in his performative isolation by the window. But the psychological infection is setting in. Insomnia plagues her as she analyzes Vincent's predatory threats alongside Dante's weaponized honesty. Soon, she adapts to the pathology of her environment. She masters the superficiality of charity galas, learning to smile amid systemic corruption. At the hospital, she uses her medical routine as a desperate anchor to a fading reality. While her brother's growing distance proves the isolation tactic worked. Stick with me. This is where the cage snaps shut. The life lesson here is chilling. Normalization is a slow poison. If you spend enough time pretending to belong in the dark, your eyes will adjust, and you will completely forget the light. You and I both know the isolation phase is critical in these behavioral profiles. Almost immediately, her brother Danny sensed the shift. He stopped calling. His texts became single words. When she finally confronted him, his anger shattered her. He accused her of playing a dark, unrecognizable role, hiding a truth he couldn't uncover. She wanted to scream the facts, that every piece of expensive furniture in his apartment was bought with blood money to save his life. But she remained silent. Danny demanded space, pulling away from the one person who sacrificed everything for him. True isolation isn't about being physically alone. It is standing in a crowded room, holding a devastating secret that you cannot share with anyone. When Lena discovers Dante nursing a whiskey after a violent syndicate shootout, we witness the classic rationalization of a megalomaniac narcissist. Dante claims his iron grip on the organization is a selfless burden, asserting his departure would trigger a lethal power vacuum. This is a textbook delusion of indispensable grandeur. Yet, Lena does not recoil. Instead, we see the nascent stages of Stockholm Syndrome taking root in her psyche, a victim finding twisted nobility in her captor's chains. You and I must understand that when she perceives longing in his eyes, she is projecting her own need to humanize a predator. The life lesson here is profoundly simple. The absolute most dangerous lies are the ones we willingly tell ourselves just to justify the darkness we find in others. The clinical manipulation deepens seamlessly. Dante asks what she would do in his position, an engineered vulnerability designed to draw his captive closer. Lena responds with a naive belief that love outweighs power. She confesses her anxiety over deceiving her brother Dante, terrified he would discover she sacrificed her autonomy to pay his debts. Here, the megalomaniac narcissist recognizes an opening. Dante bridges the physical space, touching her hand, a gesture establishing proprietary dominance under the guise of empathy. They commiserate over being trapped by obligations to loved ones, engaging in terrifying psychological mirroring. In life, we often confuse shared trauma with genuine connection, entirely forgetting that two drowning people will only ever pull each other further under. We must observe how the cognitive dissonance fully collapses here. Lena acknowledges the danger, stating she should establish distance, yet her body remains immobilized by her captor's physical contact. This paralysis is a hallmark of advanced Stockholm Syndrome. The victim recognizes warmth with threat, but equates the predator she is not stopping. When she whispers that she is not stopping, she effectively surrenders her remaining psychological defenses. Dante's answering smile is not romantic affection, but the quiet satisfaction of a megalomaniac narcissist successfully closing the trap. It is a chilling descent masquerading as romance. The fundamental lesson is clear. Recognizing a toxic boundary means nothing if you lack the strength to enforce it. We inevitably rationalize what we have already surrendered to. The pathology of their codependence escalates through mundane routines. Shared coffees and feigned interest in her shifts serve to normalize the abnormal. 3 months into this confinement, a critical shift occurs during Dante's episode of severe physical pain. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? Lena finds him paralyzed by agony, having endured 6 hours of silent suffering. A megalomaniac narcissist views physical weakness as a fatal vulnerability, hence his rigid refusal of assistance. Yet for Lena, his pain is the ultimate psychological trigger. It activates her clinical need to heal, binding her inextricably to the monster. The simple truth is this: we are never more susceptible to absolute manipulation than when we firmly believe we are the ones providing the rescue. Their interaction devolves into a fascinating struggle for dominance. When Lena insists on treating his spasms, she monomaniac narcissist strips the megalomaniac narcissist of his unyielding control. Dante attempts to enforce their arrangement, reminding her she was purchased to be a wife, not a clinician. However, her profound Stockholm Syndrome compels her to cross that boundary. As she administers heat therapy, the physical tension leaves his body, creating a dangerous false intimacy. He justifies his self-destruction by claiming he cannot afford the luxury of rest, a classic paranoid delusion of the criminal elite. It is a haunting display of mutual pathology. The essential lesson here is that taking on another person's pain never truly heals them. It merely transfers their underlying sickness directly into your own psychological bloodstream. The clinical detachment shatters in this exchange. Dante expresses raw frustration with his failing body, an agonizing admission for someone whose identity requires absolute power. Lena responds not with fear, but with maternal correction. She asserts her role as his wife, explicitly stepping outside the financial parameters of their contract. When Dante asks why she cares, he is probing the depth of her conditioning. He knows he is paying for compliance. Yet he tests for genuine emotional submission. Her admission that she is failing to keep things transactional is the ultimate victory for her captor. We must remember this crucial life lesson. The moment you begin making sincere excuses for the person holding the key to your cage, that heavy iron door might as well be welded shut permanently. Notice the strategic retreat. Dante commands her to stop before she articulates her attachment. The megalomaniac narcissist must always dictate the pace of emotional consumption. Lena retreats to her wing, seeking reprieve from the pressure of her Stockholm Syndrome. However, Dante does not allow the distance to hold. He slips a note beneath her door, expressing a calculated gratitude. This is a textbook breadcrumbing technique, offering just enough vulnerable humanity to keep her tightly tethered. As they prepare for the high-stakes Westmore Foundation gala, the psychological snare is set. The lesson to internalize here is that intermittent reinforcement, a sudden drop of kindness is in a sea of rigid control, is the single most potent behavioral drug ever synthesized by the human mind. Let us open this clinical case file together, shall we? We begin in an environment engineered for absolute dominance. 500 elite guests gathered in a venue of staggering opulence. Crystal chandeliers and marble floors formed a glittering arena. For a megalomaniac narcissist like Dante, this was his natural hunting ground. He had already instructed Lena to stay close, systematically stripping away her autonomy under the guise of protection. As they entered, the social ecosystem recalibrated around his dark gravity. Lena felt the predatory gaze of the room, profoundly alienated among the expensive tuxedos and dripping jewels. Then the primary rival of this behavioral study approached. A distinguished man of 50, greeting Dante with a warmth that concealed a razor-sharp agenda. Richard Blackwood possessed the calculating stare of an apex predator. He noted his sudden attendance with Fent was driven by a desire to examine Dante's new wife. Lena deployed a forced smile, utilizing politeness as a psychological shield against his probes. When Richard suggested Dante kept his illicit business separate from his family, it was a deliberate diagnostic test. Lena maintained a neutral facade, confirming her preference for this division. Richard then made a fascinating assertion, claiming Dante had trained her well. Dante's grip tightened on his wheelchair as he defended her autonomy, a reaction designed to maintain his own savior narrative. Richard merely smiled, noting the suspicious suddenness of their union. "Let them talk," Dante replied, displaying the pure dismissiveness of a megalomaniac entirely secure in his constructed reality. The atmospheric pressure shifted as Richard introduced the concept of circulating rumors. Dante into a quiet, heavily controlled register. A classic intimidation tactic. Richard casually weaponized the optics of their rapid marriage following Dante's injury, questioning the true motivation behind their arrangement. When Dante confronted him, Richard retreated behind the facade of mere observation. Lena, exhibiting the profound early stages of Stockholm Syndrome, instinctively moved to defend her captor. She firmly declared their marriage was entirely private. Richard analyzed her defense with clinical amusement. "Spoken like a devoted wife," he observed, planting a psychological seed of doubt by noting that devotion is difficult to prove when alternative transactional explanations so clearly exist. Lena's behavioral inhibition failed as she demanded Richard state his implications directly, identifying his words as psychological warfare. Dante applied a tactile warning, squeezing her hand to assert nonverbal dominance and regulate her outburst. Richard was delighted by her reactive state. He systematically detailed the dominant theory, that their union was a compensated business arrangement designed to project stability during Dante's physical recovery. When Lena challenged his personal assessment, Richard adopted a purely empirical stance. He stated that beliefs are irrelevant compared to provable metrics, which showed only a rapid union and immense financial benefit. Lena's desperate counter-argument, claiming they simply mutually benefited from one another, tragically reinforced the very transactional framework she was trying to develop. You and I must carefully analyze what happens next. Dante repositioned himself between Richard and Lena in a territorial display of possession disguised as protection. Richard retreated, signaling a successful psychological reconnaissance mission. Dante then explained the reality. Richard was using their marriage as a stress test to evaluate Dante's operational vulnerabilities. Dante's solution was to aggressively manipulate the public narrative. The rest of the evening became a highly choreographed behavioral performance. They executed a flawless display of synchronized devotion, utilizing constant physical contact as a visual deterrent. Lena maintained a rigid, painful smile, heavily dissociating through endless interactions. The ambient paranoia was absolutely suffocating as she felt the collective gaze of the room, hunting for micro-expressions of fraudulence. Let us examine the psychological framework of this underworld. Margaret Chen introduced herself as the widow of Marcus. She presented a classic case of cognitive dissonance, absolving her late husband by claiming he chose his violent life. Lena offered standard condolences, but Margaret rejected them. She delivered the cold truth of their ecosystem. Loyalty is the apex currency. Love and familial bonds are secondary, merely tools to prove one's unbreakable nature. This revelation fell upon Lena like a suffocating shroud. She had tethered herself to a megalomaniac's environment, where human connections are measured by utility and affection is suspect. The lesson here is bleak but vital. In systems built on absolute control, vulnerability is never a virtue. It is a profound liability. Lena probed the widow for signs of regret regarding her marriage. Margaret's smile was steeped in trauma bonding. She claimed she stayed because of love, a textbook rationalization. But what if the bond is merely complicated? Margaret noted that without love as a psychological shield, enduring pain becomes profoundly difficult. Let you and I examine Lena's reaction here. She observed Dante conversing with a city councilman. His affect was tightly controlled, a classic narcissistic trait masking the predator beneath. He thrived among sharks like Richard Blackwood. Lena realized her contract was not a business deal, but a behavioral trap. Later, as couples danced, Dante watched with calculated longing. When Lena asked if he missed dancing, his honest admission of grief surprised her. We see a fascinating shift as Lena stepped in front of his wheelchair. She initiated a dance, distinct from the waltz of the elite. She swayed while gripping his hands, the chair acting as a physical barrier, yet a psychological anchor. It was a defiant display against the physical limitations Dante harbored. The audience of social predators naturally observed this anomaly. Lena closed her eyes, submerging herself in the sensory input rather than maintaining her performative mask. When the music ceased, Dante offered quiet gratitude, thanking her for not treating him as a defective specimen. She validated his altered state without pity. They maintained this intimate sphere for several more songs. The genuine emotional resonance deeply terrified Lena's survival instincts. As they retreated, the rival operative, Richard Blackwood, monitored them. The transit home was submerged in silence. Lena experienced acute physiological exhaustion, the somatic toll of maintaining a fabricated persona. Yet she registered a dark satisfaction in their united survival against Blackwood's psychological warfare. In the elevator, Dante commended her adaptation to their ruthless ecosystem. When Lena mentioned she only had 9 months remaining, the temporal boundary struck them like a physical blow. The countdown should have triggered the relief of impending liberation. Instead, it activated an anxiety indicative of her deepening captivity. Dante withdrew to his isolated wing without his customary farewell. Lena almost allowed it, craving isolation to process her dissonance. Margaret's conditioning echoed in Lena's memory. One stays even when the environment is hostile. Lena halted Dante's retreat. She forced an analysis of the evening's tension, noting Blackwood's attempts to breach his psychological defenses. Dante initially deployed denial, but quickly conceded the vulnerability. He articulated the precarious nature of their transactional bond. If his subordinates detected the artificiality of their union, his empire would face immediate destabilization. The proposed solution was intensified deception. Then, his stoic mask cracked. He confessed that her departure would decimate a fragile emotional capacity he believed he had lost. This unfiltered admission permeated the sterile air. It was a dangerous deviation from his typical emotional regulation. Lena's autonomic nervous systems spiked as she confessed her own symptomology. She admitted the contractual parameters had dissolved for her weeks prior. Her public display of loyalty was a genuine attachment. Now, you and I must recognize the classic markers of Stockholm Syndrome taking root here. Dante acknowledged the danger of this emotional transgression. He warned that obliterating the boundary between captor and willing partner was an irreversible psychological shift. He reminded her of the exit strategy, 9 months until total liberation. Yet, the insidious nature of trauma bonding had already rewired her desires. She asked what would happen if she no longer desired freedom from his control. It was an alarmingly transparent question, stripping away their defensive mechanisms and exposing their mutual dependency. Dante responded by breaching her physical boundaries. The megalomaniac revealed a startling cognitive conflict. Dante stated he would experience profound guilt if her retention was merely the result of contractual entrapment. Lena countered, asserting her autonomy in choosing captivity, promising he would have to earn that choice daily. The subsequent physical intimacy was devoid of the performative aesthetic of their wedding. It was a desperate exchange of repressed psychological energy, a frantic grounding mechanism in an unstable environment. Lena exhibited the victim's ultimate surrender, clinging to the architect of her confinement. When the physical connection severed, reality reinstated its parameters. Dante correctly diagnosed that this shift fundamentally altered their dynamic. While he proposed a logical analysis, Lena opted for emotional avoidance, suggesting they simply exist in the moment without clinical dissection. They engaged in mundane verbal exchange typical of normalized relationships. From a clinical perspective, this normalization of a hostile arrangement is fascinating. Around 3 a.m, Lena's consciousness faded. She awoke later to find Dante had deployed a subtle proximity control, remaining near her to enforce their connection. Over the subsequent weeks, the environment shifted into a terrifyingly domestic pattern. Dante minimized his external operations, hovering in her vicinity to monitor his emotional supply. Lena willingly entered his domain under the guise of solitary work. When her brother, Danny, observed them, the behavioral changes were undeniable. He noted the complete eradication of their former alienation. Lena struggled to articulate the insidious progression of her attachment and to explain how her captor became her psychological anchor. Danny identified the cognitive dissonance in her evasion, accusing her of active concealment. Let us dissect what she was burying here together. She was hiding the foundational trauma of their arrangement, terrified that exposing the transactional roots would shatter the delicate illusion they had constructed. When Dante returned, Danny subjected their subtle expressions to intense scrutiny, observing the automated physical synchronization that develops between captor and dependent. Later, Dante engaged in a manipulative test of compliance. He suggested she disclose the origins of their marriage to her brother, claiming Danny deserved to know she had sacrificed herself for his benefit. Lena fiercely rejected the proposition. She knew the introduction of guilt would annihilate her brother's perception. The lesson is clear. An illusion built on sacrifice requires constant deception. We observe Lena wrestling with profound cognitive dissonance regarding her brother. Dante ruthlessly analyzed her familial isolation, noting that secrets are simply lies wearing a different neurological label. The anticipated shame of exposing her transactional reality induced absolute psychological paralysis. Later, in the isolation of her bedroom, Lena reviewed the foundational document of her captivity, the marriage contract. She scanned the exit clauses promising full financial compensation after 12 months. With exactly 6 months remaining, a psychologically healthy subject would experience immense relief. Lena, however, experienced acute panic. The Stockholm Syndrome had finally metastasized. Dante was no longer the megalomaniac funding her existence. Her traumatized brain had rewritten him into an essential attachment figure she desperately craved. She developed the classic delusion of the captive, believing her aggressor truly understood her. The contractual mechanism that engineered her captivity was now perceived as a primary threat. She engaged in compulsive behavior, repeatedly reading the clinical exit clause until visual fatigue set in. The document allowed no framework for their severe trauma-bonded attachment. A sudden knock triggered a hyper-vigilant startle response. She rapidly concealed the paper beneath her pillow as Dante entered, calmly probing her insomnia. Lena utilized defensive evasion, projecting her internal anxiety entirely onto her brother, expressing distress over their deteriorating bond. Dante, operating with calculated spatial dominance, advanced to the edge of her bed and proposed a highly manipulative, narcissistic solution, offering her brother a carefully sanitized fraction of the truth. To understand a case like this, you and I have to strip away the romance and look at the clinical reality. The assertion that their contractual marriage was evolving into genuine affection is a classic symptom of trauma bonding. Dante, exhibiting textbook traits of a megalomaniacal narcissist, understood exactly how to manipulate her empathy. When he confessed his dread over their eventual separation, it wasn't a romantic breakthrough. It was a calculated deployment of vulnerability. By presenting himself as a damaged protector burdened by secrets, he effectively weaponized Lena's own compassion against her. Her tightening throat? That is the physical manifestation of the trap snapping shut. The moment the captive decides to save her captor. When we examine Lena's confession of love, we are observing the precise moment Stockholm Syndrome takes absolute hold. She vocalized her attachment not with joy, but with the flat resignation of a patient accepting a terminal diagnosis. Dante's response is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. By warning her about the violence of his world and reminding her of the 12-month contract, he creates the illusion of choice. The narcissist doesn't force the victim to stay. He orchestrates the environment so she fights for the privilege of remaining in her cage. He tells her she isn't built for his world, knowing her natural human stubbornness will compel her to prove him entirely wrong. He finally admitted his selfishness, confessing he would let her stay despite the heavy cost. This is the absolute apex of emotional enmeshment. They abandoned the rigid safety of their initial 6-month arrangement for a shared delusion of defiance. When Lena pulled him closer, she was actively choosing the danger, a psychological defense mechanism where the victim aligns with the aggressor to regain a false sense of agency. Their physical intimacy that night was not merely an act of passion. It was the biological cementing of a deeply pathological bond. The space between them became charged with both terror and possibility. A highly addictive cocktail of adrenaline and attachment that makes leaving practically impossible. Let's look at the morning after, shall we? They woke tangled together, the physical contract shoved under a pillow like a repressed memory. Dante's admission that waking up beside her was both terrifying and right is a rare, perhaps genuine crack in his clinical detachment. But cognitive dissonance immediately set in. The following weeks were governed by the overwhelming psychological weight of their reality. The boundary between business and personal had collapsed entirely. When Vincent observed their newfound comfort during dinner, he wasn't witnessing young lovers. He was a secondary predator, recognizing that the alpha had successfully integrated a new psychological hostage into the syndicate's operational structure. The dinner conversation provides a fascinating case study in criminal pack dynamics. Vincent probed the structural integrity of their arrangement by targeting Lena's hospital job. Dante's defense of her independence is a brilliant paradox often utilized by high-level manipulators. By publicly championing her autonomy, he tightens her psychological tether to him. He presents himself as the enlightened protector against Vincent's traditional mob scrutiny. Yet, the introduction of Richard Blackwood's external Haitian environmental stress acts as a sudden environmental stressor. Blackwood wasn't just asking questions. He was threatening to expose the foundational lie of their trauma bond. The temperature drop was palpable, raw, survival instinct kicking in. External threats are the most effective catalyst for accelerating a trauma bond. Blackwood had uncovered the financial transactions, the medical bills, the apartment, the very blood money that purchased Lena's compliance. Vincent coldly laid out the stakes. Blackwood wanted territory and control, and this fraudulent marriage was the vulnerability he intended to exploit. Notice the absolute shift in Lena's behavioral profile here. Her stomach twisted not out of fear for her own safety, but out of fear for Dante's empire. She is no longer analyzing her escape. She is actively analyzing how to protect the structural integrity of the man who bought her. The captive has officially become a willing conspirator in the crime. This is where the psychology gets truly haunting. Lena herself proposed the solution. Make the criminal underworld feel the authenticity of their bond. She is volunteering to perform her own psychological subjugation on a public stage. Vincent recognized the strategic value of her complete assimilation, offering the upcoming charity ball as their proving ground. When Dante apologized for dragging her into this mess, it was another microdose of guilt designed to keep her tethered. Lena's response, that she chose him and everything else is just details, is the tragic anthem of the institutionalized victim. She has convinced herself that her captivity was a conscious, empowered choice, entirely blind to the bars around her. The upcoming charity ball functioned as a high-stakes psychological deadline. Then the crisis point arrived. 2 weeks prior, Blackwood weaponized the empirical truth, threatening to expose the financial records if Dante didn't surrender the East Side territory. When Dante showed Lena the blackmail on his screen, it was a calculated test of her conditioning. He offered to concede the territory, feigning a willingness to sacrifice his criminal ambitions for her safety. This is how the megalomaniac ensures total loyalty. By presenting the option of surrender, he forces the victim to demand retaliation. Dante's clenched fists and talk of violent fallout were theatrical cues meant to trigger Lena's protective instincts. And here is the terrifying conclusion of our behavioral study. Lena offered the third option, controlling the narrative by weaponizing the truth. She suggested they publicly admit the marriage began as a transaction, but claim it evolved into genuine love. The captive is now dictating the terms of her own psychological imprisonment to the world. Dante's simulated shock at this insane idea only validated her brilliance in her own mind. She genuinely believes that by owning the coercive origins of their relationship, she neutralizes the threat. In reality, she is cementing her own delusion, wrapping the chains so tightly around her own neck that the captor never has to lift a finger again. A flawless, devastating psychological victory. Stick with me. This is where the psychological entanglement reaches its apex. Dante initiated a calculated silence, simulating ethical hesitations regarding the public judgment she would face. Lena, consumed by Stockholm Syndrome, eagerly stripped away her own victimhood, declaring she was volunteering for the sacrifice. She then confessed her love, framing their intense trauma bond as a defiant victory against external threats. Dante's micro-expressions fractured. He initiated intense physical proximity, anchoring himself to his captive. He mirrored her confession, notably framing his previous emotional withholding as a battle against defeat, a classic narcissistic trait. Together, they mutually agreed to retroactively invalidate the legal contract, completely rewriting their transactional origins into a highly romanticized narrative of pure destiny. Dante broke physical contact to re-establish operational command. His strategy was pure megalomania. Co-opt the narrative and execute a public disclosure at the charity ball. The subsequent 2 weeks became a rigorous exercise in cognitive conditioning. Dante engineered a sanitized version of reality to neutralize Richard's leverage, while Lena engaged in deep self-indoctrination, rehearsing the fabricated narrative until her physiological stress responses vanished. However, the psychological variables shifted dramatically the night before the event. Her brother, Danny, requested an urgent meeting. The moment she crossed his threshold, he shattered her constructed reality. He confessed he had uncovered the financial truth, identifying the systemic salary-like payments that exposed her marriage as a compensated transaction. Lena's carefully maintained delusion collapsed completely. We reached the critical rupture with reality. Her brother, Danny, brutally confronts her with the objective truth. He correctly identifies Dante as a dangerous crime boss and accurately labels her sacrifice as destructive martyrdom. Stick with me. This is where it gets interesting. Instead of waking up, Lena vehemently defends her captor. She weaponizes her own trauma, claiming she made a rational choice to save her brother from debt, restructuring the narrative to frame her enslavement as a triumph. She insists she found something beautiful in the darkness. The devastating truth of life is that a human mind, desperate to justify its own profound suffering, will effortlessly rewrite a horrific tragedy into a beautiful love story just to survive waking up in the morning. Let us examine this initial trauma response together. The subject, Danny, discovers the financial transaction that funded his survival. He reacts with textbook displaced aggression. He accuses his sister, Lena, of falling for the man who purchased her, using words as blunt instruments. Lena exhibits classic trauma bonding behaviors, defending her captor and rationalizing her Stockholm Syndrome. She claims love for a man whose environment is inherently predatory. Danny's pride is shattered, insisting he would have preferred expiration over her sacrifice. Lena's response is clinically pragmatic. She prefers him breathing and hostile rather than deceased, She withdraws to preserve her emotional baseline. The lesson here is fundamental. Pride is a dangerous condition, blinding us to the desperate sacrifices made to keep us alive. We observe Lena's psychological collapse the moment she reaches the isolation of her vehicle. The physiological release of tears is immediate. Her dependency on the megalomaniacal narcissist, Dante, is activated by a single phone call. Her voice fractures as she admits she is unwell. Dante exercises control under the guise of protection, deploying a vehicle to retrieve her. Back at his fortified environment, Dante serves as the primary anchor. She physically collapses against him, a textbook display of a victim seeking sanctuary from the architect of her isolation. She relays Danny's accusations of martyrdom and deception. Dante dismisses Danny's reaction as mere emotional injury. He validates her, reinforcing her total reliance on his version of reality. It is a brilliant and terrifying psychological manipulation. Let us open this case file together, you and I, and examine the pathology of survival. The subject, Lena, rationalizes her deception not as a moral failing, but as an act of maternal preservation toward her brother, Danny. She interprets his anticipated rejection as a temporary cognitive dissonance. Yet, the emotional scaffolding she relies upon is entirely dependent on Dante, the architect of her current reality. She seeks physical proximity, curling against his side to regulate her autonomic nervous system. This is a textbook trauma response, seeking safety in the very source of the instability. The lesson here is quite simple. Human beings will always choose a familiar danger over an unknown safety, rewriting their own moral codes to survive the night. As we observe the morning of the charity gala, we see Lena engaging in a ritualistic application of cosmetics, constructing psychological armor to face apex predators. Beneath this fabricated exterior, her baseline anxiety remains critically elevated. Dante approaches her, their exchange revealing a shared recognition of their precarious dynamic. She questions the logic of their exposure, driven by a fear of total ruin. Dante counters with a clinical assessment, stating that living in perpetual concealment is its own form of destruction. He offers her the illusion of controlling the narrative. Lena realizes she lacks his cold certainty, but she accepts his presence as a substitute. We often wear masks so convincingly that we forget the fragile, terrified flesh underneath. You and I must carefully note the somatic markers of Lena's distress during the transit. Her hands display visible tremors as they approach the flashing cameras. She anchors herself to Dante, a clear act of physical dependence. Upon entering, the collective scrutiny of the elite acts as a psychological pressure cooker. Here, we encounter Richard Blackwood, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, observing them with predatory satisfaction. His mock toast is a calculated display of superiority, anticipating their destruction. Dante dismisses Blackwood with the chilling detachment of a superior strategist, noting that the narcissist has already lost but lacks the self-awareness to realize it. True power never requires a grand performance. It simply waits for the arrogant to exhaust themselves. Dante ascends the stage, utilizing the microphone to assert dominance over the acoustic environment. He begins with philanthropic pleasantries, a prologue to disarm his targets. Then, he executes a sudden pivot, addressing the speculation regarding their 7-month marriage. The silence in the ballroom is a manifestation of collective shock. He systematically dissects the rumors, openly admitting to the transactional origins of their union. He frames his need for optical stability and Lena's financial desperation as a logical business paradigm. As the crowd vocalizes their shock, Dante introduces the anomaly in his data. He confesses that the calculated arrangement devolved into an emotional attachment. Even the most rigid systems of control can be compromised by the unpredictable variable of human affection. Dante reclassifies their initial contract as obsolete, gripping Lena's hand to reinforce their unified front. He manipulates the narrative, claiming this messy, unconventional bond holds more value than any financial document. When Lena takes the microphone, we observe a fascinating psychological phenomenon. She defends her initial desperation regarding Danny's medical debt, framing it as a survival mechanism. Yet, she openly declares her inability to imagine existence without Dante. Clinically speaking, we must analyze this through the lens of Stockholm Syndrome. She has developed a profound protective infatuation with the man who commodified her trauma. Desperation often forces the human mind to build comfortable homes within the very cages designed to keep us contained. Let us look at the environmental response here. The initial silence is oppressive, broken only when Margaret Chen initiates a cascade of applause, neutralizing the threat and hope. We see the megalomaniac narcissist, Richard Blackwood, physically paralyzed. His leverage has been dismantled by their preemptive self-exposure. Dante whispers a claim of victory, asserting they have completely stripped the secret of its power. However, Lena experiences severe cognitive dissonance. She recognizes that crossing this psychological threshold is irreversible. The public assimilation of their truth means they must navigate an unregulated aftermath. The most dangerous lies we tell are often the truths we finally admit, because once spoken, they can never be put back into the dark. Lena rationalizes her emotional dependence, assigning higher empirical value to her feelings than to the approval of an ignorant society. As they exit, the psychological gravity of their confession manifests as a profound vulnerability. The crowd displays micro-expression hespercharias, ranging from respect to overt contempt. Blackwood soon intercepts their path. His demeanor mimics shattered glass, a brittle hostility masking his deep narcissistic injury. He attempts to reassert dominance, mocking their performance and highlighting the institutional damage they have inflicted upon themselves. He accuses Dante of projecting pure desperation rather than honesty. A wounded predator will always try to convince you that your shield is a fatal flaw. Dante counters Blackwood with a calm assertion about the societal currency of honesty. Blackwood then pivots his psychological attack toward Lena, attempting to induce shame by reminding her of her financially motivated confession. Lena successfully masks her internal panic, maintaining a steady vocal tone as she challenges his inability to accept defeat. Blackwood retreats, leaving an atmosphere heavy with the recalibration of power dynamics among the elite. Dante accurately identifies these individuals as scavengers and orchestrates a tactical retreat through a secondary exit. Safe within the vehicle, Lena's adrenaline rapidly crashes, leaving her physiologically depleted. True exhaustion only hits when the human body finally realizes the immediate danger has passed. As we examine the final phase of this crisis, but consider Dante's definition of courage. He reframes Lena's terror not as a weakness, but as the essential catalyst for bravery. Back at their isolated penthouse, the absence of external stimuli creates an oppressive vacuum. They are adrift in unregulated psychological territory. The trauma cycle reignites when Lena receives a message from her brother, Danny. He has consumed the public broadcast and demands an immediate confrontation. Lena experiences an autonomic reaction to the anticipated familial rejection. Dante, exhibiting a rare moment of empathetic delegation, urges her to repair the fractured sibling bond while he remains behind. The most agonizing fractures to heal are always the ones found within our own bloodline. Let us turn the page and look at this behavioral shift. Lena strips away her defensive armor, the cosmetics and formal wear that allowed her to face 500 observers. Her baseline state is pure exhaustion and fear. Danny initiates contact, his appearance indicating severe sleep deprivation and heightened cortisol levels. He issues an immediate retraction of his previous hostility. He experienced a cognitive breakthrough after watching her public statement. He acknowledges his own narcissistic focus on guilt, finally recognizing her profound burden. He validates her impossible choice, admitting she saved him from both cellular deterioration and absolute financial ruin. His pride had triggered a defense mechanism that alienated his only protector. True forgiveness requires looking past our own damaged egos to see the pain of others. Lena experiences a physiological stress response as she confesses her initial deception. Danny rationalizes her behavior, acknowledging her lifelong role as his primary caregiver. This dynamic does not vanish upon legal adulthood. Then, Lena vocalizes the completion of her Stockholm syndrome. She admits her attachment to Dante is no longer transactional but deeply genuine. She observed their mutual public display and categorized it as an authentic bond. Danny absorbs this diagnostic shift and physically embraces her. He reinforces their familial foundation, assuring her that biological connection supersedes temporary psychological fractures. He then carefully inquires about Dante's treatment of her. We must remember that the most vital human attachments are those that survive our deepest interpersonal betrayals. Danny employs humor as a coping mechanism, threatening retaliation against a known criminal element should Dante harm his sister. It is a psychologically necessary assertion of control. They engage in an extended debriefing, exchanging granular details about Dante's behavioral patterns and their shared existence. When questioned about the one-year contract, Lena displays severe avoidance behavior. She is paralyzed by the fear that Dante still views her as a disposable strategic asset. Her anxiety is rooted in the complete absence of empirical data. Danny accurately identifies her flawed methodology, urging direct confrontation over passive assumption. Assumption is the absolute enemy of emotional clarity. We often suffer far more in the silent anticipation of rejection than we do in the reality of it. Let us observe Lena's mental state during her transit back to the primary environment. She ruminates on the variables that solidified her attachment to a man she never intended to love. Upon arrival, Dante is exhibiting brooding behavior, staring out over the territory he controls. She reports the successful de-escalation with Danny, but her hypervigilance detects an anomaly in Dante's vocal tone. Dante introduces the impending expiration of their legal arrangement, now 5 months away. This temporal boundary triggers a physiological shock to her system. She challenges his intent with uncharacteristic sharpness, asking if they should address the termination or maintain their shared delusion of permanence. Dante finally alters his physical orientation to face her. Avoidance can only ever delay our inevitable collision with the unvarnished truth. Let us examine the psychological battlefield of their so-called marriage. Lena confronts Dante, dismantling the delusion of their contractual arrangement. She demands honesty, a rare commodity in Dante's world. Dante responds with the typical defense mechanism of a man accustomed to absolute control. He hides his fear of abandonment behind the sterile language of legal obligations. He claims he wants her to have a choice, but it is a calculated retreat. You see, when a man whose entire identity is built on power suddenly feels vulnerable, he will use logic as a shield against emotional ruin. The lesson here is quite simple. The walls we build to protect ourselves are often the very things that keep us isolated in our own self-made prisons. Lena refuses to play his game. She demands to know what he truly wants, breaking through his clinical detachment. Lena's response exhibits a fascinating deviation from classic Stockholm Syndrome. Instead of merely empathizing with her captor, she actively challenges his parameters. She voices a desire to destroy the contract, the very instrument of her initial subjugation. Dante questions her autonomy, needing absolute certainty that her compliance is voluntary. He projects his anxieties onto her, suggesting she will eventually feel trapped by his dangerous reality. Lena astutely mirrors his projection, forcing him to confront his own emotional limitations. We must always remember this simple truth. We often accuse others of the exact betrayals we are most terrified of experiencing ourselves. Dante insists he will never abandon her, locking them into a volatile and fascinating psychological stalemate. Dante reveals the obsessive rumination of a hyper-vigilant mind. He confesses he has simulated her departure thousands of times, a mental compulsion used to brace for trauma. He admits losing her would diminish him, a terrifying concession for a man whose survival depends on invulnerability. Lena correctly identifies their shared pathology. They are using logic to suppress the vulnerability of genuine attachment. You and I have seen this defense mechanism before. When the heart feels exposed, the brain rushes in to build a rational fortress. The lesson is undeniable. You cannot negotiate your way out of human feeling. Dante claims he only wants her to have a free choice. Lena demands he stop analyzing the situation and simply ask for what he desires. He moves closer, his rigid control finally fracturing. Lena's declaration is a profound psychological pivot. She accepts the violence and pathology of his world, stripping away the illusion of a sanitized life. She makes a conscious choice to bind herself to a dangerous man. Dante produces the physical contract, the artifact of their mutual manipulation. By offering it to her to destroy, he surrenders his ultimate tool of leverage. It is a rare moment where a man accustomed to absolute dominion willingly relinquishes control. As she tears the document to pieces, she dismantles the barrier that kept them emotionally segregated. Sometimes, the most meaningful step forward requires destroying the safety nets we worked so hard to build. The paper falls to the floor, ending the transactional nature of their bond. They are no longer captor and captive, but willing participants in a shared reality. Their mutual affirmation solidifies a new behavioral baseline. Dante embraces her with a desperation that betrays his underlying fear of loss. He articulates his core psychological need. He desires to be perceived as a human being, not merely as a megalomaniacal force of nature. Lena acknowledges his pathological need for self-reliance and vows to challenge it. However, the external world rarely respects internal breakthroughs. By the following morning, their private psychological shift becomes a public spectacle. The viral dissemination of their confession shatters the curated image of the untouchable boss. The media consumes their vulnerability entirely. It serves as a stark reminder that true intimacy is fragile. The world is always waiting to weaponize our most private truths for its own entertainment. Lena's phone rings endlessly as the chaos begins. Lena experiences the disorientation of sudden public scrutiny. It is a jarring transition from private trauma to public consumption. Vincent, acting as the clinical voice of pragmatism, arrives to deliver the consequences. The syndicate board, an entity driven purely by survival, views emotional honesty as a liability. Half the board interprets Dante's public confession as the erratic behavior of a compromised mind. The others see it as a ruthless display of dominance. Vincent presents the impending formal review. Enter Richard Blackwood, a classic opportunistic predator aiming to use Dante's vulnerability to usurp his throne. You and I must recognize the danger here. In any hierarchy of power, showing your heart is often interpreted as baring your throat to the wolves. Blackwood is moving in for the kill. Vincent outlines a strategy rooted in behavioral manipulation. Lena must prove her utility to a group of dangerous men. Her independence and career are no longer personal achievements, but calculated data points to prove she is not a parasite. She must weaponize her genuine affection to secure Dante's political survival. When Vincent departs, the crushing weight of their reality descends. Lena exhibits guilt, a natural response to causing systemic instability. Dante, however, undergoes a fascinating cognitive shift. He compartmentalizes the emotional fallout and embraces his innate predatory nature. The lesson we can draw from this is simple. Guilt is a useless emotion when the house is on fire. You must focus entirely on extinguishing the flames. Dante's face hardens into a familiar mask, signaling his return to a state of unyielding psychological war. Dante's counteroffensive is a masterclass in psychological warfare. Instead of exhibiting a defensive posture, Dante chooses aggressive unity. By intertwining their identities entirely, he raises the stakes. Any attack on Lena becomes a direct assault on his sovereignty. It is a cold calculation that leverages their emotional bond as a tactical weapon. 2 weeks later, the theoretical battlefield becomes physical. Dante forces Lena into the Syndicate's hidden sanctum, exposing her to 15 hardened apex predators. These men are devoid of empathy. Analyzing the couple for any sign of weakness, Blackwood radiates the smug confidence of a narcissist who believes he has already won. Dante, completely unfazed, presents his empirical data. He uses financial stability and security metrics to construct an impenetrable wall of logic around his continued leadership. Dante executes his final unpredictable maneuver. He forces Lena into the spotlight, compelling her to testify before her psychological jury. Lena stands, her nervous system overwhelmed by intense scrutiny. Yet, she employs a strategy of radical transparency. She admits the transactional origin of their bond, neutralizing Blackwood's primary weapon. She then details Dante's resilience and cognitive superiority, framing his humanity not as a weakness, but as a critical evolutionary advantage. She confronts Blackwood directly, asserting her role as a stabilizing force rather than a disruptive variable. Let this be a lesson for us all. When standing before those who wish to see you break, the most disarming weapon you can wield is the absolute, unvarnished truth. She looks these dangerous men in the eye, proving the bond forged in survival has transformed into formidable loyalty. The narrative shifts to a high-stress tribunal. A rival associate, Richard, weaponizes psychology, arguing that emotional attachment is a systemic vulnerability. Lena counters this sociopathic logic. She asserts that eliminating weakness does not generate strength. Instead, identifying an object of supreme value creates an uncompromising defensive posture. In this violent environment, radical commitment acts as a powerful psychological deterrent. Predators hesitate when facing a target that will fight to the death. The dominant figure, Vincent, observes this exchange with clinical approval. Later, in isolation, Dante analyzes her risk-taking behavior. She refused to tolerate condescension, matching their aggression. Standing your ground in a room full of apex predators is a dangerous, yet profoundly necessary, assertion of your own absolute worth. A 10-5 verdict is delivered with sterile precision. Dante retains control, subject to rigorous quarterly evaluations. Richard suffers a severe loss of hierarchical status for leveraging personal data. Once the carefully constructed facade crumbles, crumbles. He holds Lena closely, confessing his extreme internal fear. Lena acknowledges their shared pathology, the mutual ability to simulate absolute calm while enduring immense psychological terror. That is their shared survival mechanism. The subsequent months represent a period of stabilization. Danny integrates into Dante's orbit, forming a genuine bond. Lena maintains her medical profession, straddling two radically opposed realities. There are days of intense friction, where Dante's suppressed trauma manifests as sharp, difficult hostility. True resilience is not the absence of fear, but the ability to function flawlessly despite it. Now, you and I reach the conclusion of this study. Amidst the volatility, we find periods of baseline contentment. Quiet mornings of shared routine and late-night exchanges of internal thoughts solidify Lena's commitment to this deeply flawed ecosystem. When the one-year milestone arrives, Dante presents a profound psychological admission. He openly states that his original strategic manipulation yielded an unintended emotional dependency. She has become the organizing principle of his chaotic reality. He inadvertently cured his own profound isolation. Lena validates this mutual miscalculation, initiating physical contact. They are both fundamentally inadequate at diagnosing their own core needs. We often construct the most elaborate psychological defenses, only to be saved by the very human vulnerabilities we tried so desperately to avoid. The case file concludes with the ultimate psychological sealing of the bond. Dante engineers a theatrical second wedding at the Meridian Hotel, an orchestrated environment designed to overwrite their initial transaction with a romantic delusion. Surrounded by associates who reinforce this reality, the megalomaniac narcissist delivers customized vows. He promises to choose her daily, effectively masking his obsessive control under the guise of devotion. Lena, entirely consumed by her Stockholm Syndrome, breaks down in tears and unconditionally declares her love. The transformation from victim to willing participant is complete. She has fully embraced her cage. The final harrowing lesson is this: the most permanent prisons are never built with iron bars, but with the quiet, desperate emotional agreements we willingly make with our own captors. Let's open this case file together, shall we? I choose you, Lena whispers, an intriguing manifestation of severe Stockholm Syndrome. They kiss, sealing a psychological entrapment she perceives as a genuine romance. It is fascinating how the human brain rewrites a transaction into destiny just to survive it. The initial contract, a classic symptom of Dante's megalomaniacal need for control, was slowly rationalized by Lena as a quirky twist of fate. Her brother Danny served as her only fading anchor to the real world. Meanwhile, Dante's criminal syndicate stabilized. His wheelchair was no longer a vulnerability, merely the throne from which he commanded her mind completely. The lesson here is quite simple. We will willingly believe any beautiful lie if facing the ugly truth threatens to shatter our fragile reality. In my clinical work, we call this the normalization of deviance. Lena adapted to the constant hum of violence, her cognitive dissonance fading as she justified his dark world. She convinced herself the joyful moments outnumbered the terror, a vital coping mechanism when wed to a predator. 3 years later, she finds Dante gazing out the windows of his fortress. He is brooding over Marcus Chen, the man whose violent death catalyzed their arrangement. Dante wonders aloud if the dead man would approve of their union. He uses this feigned vulnerability to pull her deeper into his web, framing a bloody sacrifice as the necessary soil for their romance. It teaches us a grim truth about human nature. Master manipulators do not just control the present environment, they reframe past traumas to keep their subjects docile and devoted. Dante pulls her onto his lap, a calculated physical reinforcement of his dominance. He whispers that real trust is not built on paper contracts, but on choosing each other daily. Notice the brilliant psychological pivot here. The megalomaniac abandons the very contract he used to trap her, knowing he has successfully imprisoned her mind instead. Lena eagerly agrees, completing the vicious cycle of her Stockholm Syndrome. She actually believes she is making a free choice, entirely romanticizing her decision to marry a violent criminal for financial survival. It highlights a profoundly simple yet tragic life lesson. When confronted with a total loss of autonomy, a captive will fiercely defend their chains as a beautiful personal awakening, simply to avoid facing the terrifying reality of their absolute helplessness. You and I must look closely at this next phase. Dante's underworld remains strictly lethal. Lena completely suppresses her ethical compass, burying the moral horror of sleeping beside a mob boss. Her brother Danny acts as the sole voice of sanity, correctly identifying that her free will is a manufactured illusion. Yet, Lena dismisses him. She embraces a severe cognitive distortion, genuinely believing that profound love can blossom from forced financial extortion. She rationalizes that starting with a lie eventually reveals the truth. It is a flawless execution of psychological conditioning. The life lesson here is hauntingly clear. The most inescapable prisons are never constructed with iron bars. They are built entirely out of the victim's own desperate need to find affection in the very monster who holds them hostage. She interprets this entrapment as true partnership, finding false comfort in being known by a man who meticulously studied her deepest vulnerabilities. 3 years after signing away her autonomy, the exhausted triage nurse no longer exists. That woman is dead, replaced by the fiercely loyal mob wife. Dante asks if she has regrets, effortlessly reading her mind because he is the one who programmed her new thought patterns. She smiles and assures him there are none regarding their bond. She trades normal happiness for a shared trauma she mistakes for intimate devotion. This brings us to a harsh but simple life lesson. True darkness rarely arrives as a terrifying nightmare. It creeps in disguised as a warm, protective embrace, slowly convincing you that enduring shared pain is the ultimate expression of loyalty. Let us conclude this case review. We are witnessing the absolute triumph of the megalomaniac over his subject. Lena fully embraces the illusion that her daily choice to stay is an act of free will, rather than the final stage of her captivity. She looks back at the bloody death of Marcus Chen and extracts a deeply twisted moral victory. She concludes that her psychological submission is a glorious, unquantifiable prize that transcends the original cold terms of her purchase. The initial extortion has vanished from her conscious mind, replaced by an absolute allegiance to her captor. It leaves us with a profoundly simple yet chilling life lesson. The ultimate victory for any predator is never just taking what they want by force. It is waiting patiently until the prey falls madly in love with the cage itself.